One time, there was a tough-minded football coach who had high expectations for his football players, like Mike Gundy. No, sorry. Wrong story. At the conclusion of practice one day, he looked down at his players and he said, "Tonight, I want each and every one of you to run 3 miles. I want you to do 200 push-ups, and I want you to study the playbook for at least an hour." And the superstars, the first team sitting right up front, said, "You can count on us, coach. We got this." That night, the first team, these superstar high school players, gathered at the captain's house to begin their exercising together, and somebody flipped on the TV, and WWE was on that night, World Wrestling Entertainment. And it was just too good to quit watching. And so before long, they're slouched down on the couch watching wrestling, and the evening slowly wasting away. Now those third stringers who had been sitting in the back of the room that day, when the coach said to run 3 miles and do 200 push-ups and study the playbook for an hour, they whined out loud, "Coach, we never get to play anyway. Why should we do any of that work?" So later that night, they gathered over at the home of the water boy, and they flicked on the TV and decided they weren't going to do anything, and they were just going to watch some TV together. And one of them said, "Come on, let's go run those miles and do those push-ups." They had a change of heart, and they actually went and did the work. Now, which of the two groups did the will of the coach? The answer is obvious. How about this one? There was a piano teacher who was a very strict disciplinarian, and she had a prodigy. She had this student who just could play anything, and she said, "Tonight I want you to practice your fingering on this complicated motet for 2 hours. You have a recital coming up, and I want you to go over it and over it and over it." And the student said, "No problem." But that night, just as the prodigy began practicing, her best friend texted her, and before you knew it, they were texting back and forth, and, the evening just went someplace. Meanwhile, another student of this teacher who wasn't very good groaned when the teacher told her to practice 2 hours that night, and she thought, "Why? I'm never going to get to play in a recital. Why should I spend the time practicing?" And that evening, her friend called, and she goes, "Let me call you back. I got to go do some things first." Now, which of these two did the will of the piano teacher? Let's try another one. There was a father who had 2 children who needed the lawn mowed. The lawn was a mess, and friends were going to be coming over for dinner, and the father went to his oldest and he said, "Nick, would you please go mow the lawn for me? We have friends coming over for dinner within the hour, and the lawn, if it gets mowed, it will look so much better." And he said, "Yeah, Dad, whatever, won't take me long. Besides, you put gas in my car, and you pay for the insurance, and the phone." Yeah, exactly. And so he went outside, and as he's going outside, that phone we provide for him, his girlfriend calls. And she goes, "We haven't seen each other in over a week. Let's go to the mall." So all of a sudden, he's gone and not giving any other thought to the lawn. So the dad, still seeing a tacky lawn, goes into his youngest child and said, "Kristen, would you please go mow the lawn right now? We've got friends coming over for dinner." And Kristen gave such an agonized howl and whine and screech. "Dad, do I have to?" She slammed her bedroom door. These aren't true stories, by the way. And just then, some of her friends start Snapchatting her. And as they started their normal 3-hour Snapchat conversation, Kristen thought for a minute and had a change of heart and told the friend she'd get back to her and went out and mowed the lawn. Now, which was the good child? You're always wanting me to say you're the good child. We've all had these experiences where the promise far exceeds the performance, where people say yes too easily and then don't follow through. I've done it. Haven't you? Every once in a while, somebody will call and say, John, can you take care of this? And I know I'm too slammed to do it. But I say yes, meaning that I will try to get to it, and then I don't, and then I feel stupid and horrible because I didn't get to it. You know, we have all been there. But it's aggravating when we ask somebody to say something and they do say yes and they don't follow through. Like when the grandparents are coming over for dinner and the children are asked to pick up your rooms and they nod yes, like that's what you want to hear, and then they go find themselves doing something else. And my children may be the only children that have ever had that issue. Those are my parents, by the way. Drives you up the wall. Okay, let's say that you have been asked to help with the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or a soccer team or your church or something. And let's say the soccer team volunteer, this mom says, I'll telephone all the parents and tell them that the game time has been changed. So the coach says, great, you take care of that and I'll take care of getting ready for the game. And she doesn't do it and nobody shows up when the game happens. That ever happened to you? Or let's say you're a computer programmer or you work in IT and you are in a cubicle and you're working on a project with the person next to you and the person next to you says, I'll have that to you in the morning so we can put it with yours and it'll be done. And you come in the next day and they haven't even started. And it's due and you have to finish it for them so that you can get it done. It's aggravating when people don't follow through on things. And none of us are saints about that, by the way. Since we've all had similar reactions and feelings, it's easy for us to understand this parable of Jesus of the two sons. The meaning is so obvious. That is, some religious people make all kinds of grandiose promises to God, but their performance doesn't live up to it. These Christians promise God, yes, God, we will be your faithful disciple. We'll carry out the mission of the church. We'll do the work in the world. You can count on us. We'll get the job done for you, God. And then they don't do anything. And so God goes and finds less churchy people who actually will go and do what God needs done in the world. To understand this parable, we really kind of understand the context that it was in, that Jesus was telling this story. Jesus' parables were always told for a reason. He just didn't start spouting off stories. This parable comes in the Gospel of Matthew, and he's fighting with the Pharisees. Now, this has been a long fight. He and the Pharisees didn't see eye to eye on much of anything. So for 3 years, there's this running conflict. And where this happens in the story is on Jesus' last week of his life. We've just had the Palm Sunday entrance. He's gone into Jerusalem. People have waved the things. And this story comes on Monday. After that. Now, when he came into the city on that Palm Sunday, he saw this beautifully well-shaped fig tree. It was so lovely to behold. It was absolutely gorgeous. But guess what? It didn't have figs. It was obvious there was no fruit on this beautiful tree. And that's what he was trying to say about the Pharisees. They looked so religious. They looked so good. But they weren't producing anything. And Jesus cursed the fig tree and it withered and died. Now, it wasn't any good anyhow because it wasn't bearing any fruit, but that's what Jesus was saying about the Pharisees. They looked spiritually alive, but they were really dead. Their hearts were dead inside, and so were their actions and their compassion. And, they weren't doing the things that Jesus thought that they needed to do to actually be living the life of the gospel. Later, Jesus compared the Pharisees to cups that looked so beautiful and clean on the inside, but inside were dirty and moldy and corroded. He said, and so it was with the hearts of the Pharisees. They looked good on the outside, but when people were watching, but the inside, their hearts were corrupted and stained. So this is where this story happens, when the Pharisees come to him and confront him. And he tells the story. There's a man who has 2 sons. He said, the first son, will you go out and work in the vineyard today? The vineyard is a mess, and there's so much work to do. We got to pick up the rocks and plant and prune and pick the grapes and produce the wine. Will you go work in the vineyard? In other words, will you get out of your building and go care for the sick and dying? Will you help the blind and the lame, the deaf, and those without a voice for themselves? Will you feed the hungry and clothe the naked and visit those in prison? And the older said, of course, Dad. You can count on me. And the older son went off to the vineyard, where he conducted a lovely worship service. And then held a Bible study on the Old Testament and enjoyed some wine and cheese and fellowship with his friends who also came to the vineyard. But the vineyard was still a mess. And there was a whole lot of work to be done. So the father approached other people on the lower rungs of society to see if they might do the work. And he approached tax collectors and tanners and pimps and prostitutes, bookies and bartenders and the homeless, and said, will you do the work in my vineyard? It's a mess. The world is a mess. Would you care for the sick and dying, the blind and the lame, and the deaf, and those without a voice? Will you feed the hungry and clothe the naked? Will you visit those in jail? And the tax collectors and the prostitutes said, are you crazy? Who do you think we are? Some goody two-shoes? Get real. And they started to walk away from the mess, but they took a second look and had a change of heart and went and did the work that needed to be done. And which were more faithful? The answer is obvious. Jesus continued, and so the tax collectors and prostitutes will enter the kingdom of God before you Pharisees. Even though you look so religious and smell so religious. Ouch. So what does that story have to do with us? A parable is an invitation for Christ to go and do God's work in the vineyard. It's messed up. The world we live in is messed up. The denomination of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ says we are disciples of Christ, a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. There are so many hurting people, sick and dying and blind and lame. If we are to truly be followers of Jesus, we have to do more than just come on Sunday morning and do worship. Now, I know there are people in this room who are of an age that you've done that work throughout your entire life, and that's what you can do now, is come to worship. I get that. But I also get that there are people that could do more. Give you an example. Over the last 4 years, we've had homeless men and women working 4 days a week fixing bicycles. Their names, if I get these, miss one, Larry, let me know. Richard, Bill, James, I think this is in order. Richard, Bill, James, Darren, Arlie, Kevin, Bonnie, Sarge, James Russell, Barry Mackey, and Lonnie. These are people, who? Vaughn, okay. These are people that come up here and work 4 days a week, or at one time, worked 4 days a week to pay it forward. Because someone loved them, they wanted to do something to show that love for someone else. Some of those people, through Larry's help and others and connections, have gotten off the streets and into apartments. Some of them ended up back on the streets because they couldn't handle a normal life. But what I want you to understand is the real story is that these men and women paying it forward, they not only fix the bikes, but they're out there on the streets looking for people who need help. Sending them up here to talk to Larry to see if they fit the criteria so they can also get off the streets and do better. I mentioned it earlier. 2 of these guys, Sarge and Barry, have life-threatening illnesses right now. Hopefully Sarge's gets taken care of on Tuesday. Yet, Barry's in the hospital saying, when can I get to the church to work on bikes? When can I get up there so I can help again? The vineyard is a mess. But God calls us to do our part. Edgemere Elementary School sits 4 blocks away, right down here in the street. I go out there every Monday and volunteer with the 5th and 6th graders. But did you know there are so many in this neighborhood who are having issues making it? We as a congregation are but one partner that works with the community school at Edgemere. During the month of October, we're having a pumpkin patch. This is a commercial right here, folks. October the 6th at 4 p.m., we're unloading 1,000 pumpkins. And if you have a weak mind and a strong back, we need you. Because we've got to get all of these pumpkins out of a truck and onto the lawn. Last year we did it in about an hour and a half because we had enough people to do it. The money that we raise from the pumpkins, every dime of it, goes to help support Edgemere Elementary School. We have we do a dinner for the faculty every year. We have the 5th grade classroom. We adopted them this year and made sure they had all the supplies that they needed. We help with field trips when the teachers find a good field trip but the school district won't fund it. We help take care of that. We have a uniform closet right over here that when parents can't afford uniforms for their kids, we make sure that those kids have clothes to wear to school. Our congregation is doing a lot over there. But there are people in this room who could maybe go over and read to a kindergartner. It doesn't take a lot of physical strength to do that. Some of these kids need a grandma or a grandpa that they can look up to and know that somebody besides just mom loves them. There are things out there. We're also doing a fall festival on October the 21st that Carol is putting together. It is going to be amazing. We've got a bounce house. We've got superheroes coming. We've got games and lots of things. So look for Carol to be hunting down some of you for the day of the fall festival on the 21st. We have people from the neighborhood coming to work the pumpkin patch. Could some of you sit out there for an hour or two and take money? It's not hard. It really isn't. But the best thing about sitting out there, working the pumpkin patch, is getting to meet the neighbors in the neighborhood. And even if they don't come to church here, knowing that they have a neighbor taking care of their school in the neighborhood, it's an amazing relationship. Working in the vineyard is hard. There are families out there that need our love and support. There are people whose families are falling apart. There are poor families living just down the street. And how we react as a church makes a difference. How we react as individuals makes a difference. Too often, we hold our worship services in the middle of the vineyard. We have our Bible studies and our small group studies, and we feel good about that. But we also have to get outside of this building, into the community. Our Wednesday night dinners actually has been a great thing of getting people from the outside to come in and fellowship with us. Some of them stay for Bible study and some of them don't. Some of them come and eat and go home, and that's great. Week before last, we ran out of food because we had 38 people come for supper. I like problems like that. I'm not saying we shouldn't worship. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have Bible studies. What I am saying is God calls us to more. God, in the parable for today, he says to the people, I will go and find somebody else who'll do the work if you won't. In other words, this parable is an invitation for us to not be like the Pharisees. It's a challenge to go into a messed up world and do the necessary work. It's hard. You know, in this parable, of all the stories that I've told, I've always put the thing on the last figure. The focus was on the last figure. The one who said they weren't going to, but actually did it. Over and over and over that happened. With Jesus, the story was flipped a little bit until the end, when he comes down to him and he says, the prostitutes and the tax collectors are going to get there first because they're willing to do the work. Jesus' problem with the Pharisees was that they didn't think they needed a change of heart. They were just fine the way they were. They were appropriately religious. They knew all the formulas and they knew what they needed to do. And Jesus comes along and flips the script. So many times in the Gospels, Jesus turned the tables on people, and I don't mean literally in the temple, well, that too. God's people have consistently throughout history been blind to their own need to have a change of heart. They've been gotten blind and started out, we're going to serve, and then, okay, we got to take care of us. And Jesus is saying, no, you've got to get back out to here. We have to see the needs of people in the world. We have to be a movement for wholeness in a fragmented, messed up, crazy world. I'm always amazed at the spiritual insights of Jesus' parables. They're so brilliant. They're so right on. They seem to reveal the very heart of God. He told a story, 2 sons. It was quite simple. One son, would you go and work in my vineyard? And the son said, yes. And then didn't. And the second son, he says, would you work in my vineyard today? And the second son says, no, I've got too much stuff. And had a change of heart and did it. Which did the will of the Father? And just like the very beginning, the answer is so obvious. Now, I want to remind you of one thing. Like most parents, the father in the story continued to love both sons. Even the one who didn't do what he said he was going to do, God continues to love. The son wasn't kicked out of the house and told never to return. God continues to love us. A love that is so great that our lack of actions, even our denials and our betrayals, will not change God's love for us. But still, Christ calls us to follow, to back up our words with our actions, and to discover the abundant life that is ours through Christ Jesus, that we will do the will of the Father. Amen.